July 31st, 1945. The war wasn't over yet, but Britain was already bankrupt. Not defeated, not occupied, bankrupt. The bombs would stop soon, the celebrations would come. History would later call it a victory. But behind closed doors, Britain's leaders were staring at a different reality. There was no money left to survive the peace. No gold, no reserves, no leverage. What followed wasn't rebuilding, it was billing. For decades after the war ended, Britain kept paying, quietly, reliably, through economic booms and political change. While history moved forward, the debt stayed. Most people believe World War II ended in 1945. Financially, it didn't. It dragged on for generations. People who never saw a blackout paid for electricity. Children of soldiers paid interest. Grandchildren inherited obligations they never agreed to. And here's the part that rarely gets taught. Britain wasn't paying for victory. It was paying for permission. Permission to stay in the war, permission to survive long enough to win. This is not a story about courage or sacrifice on the battlefield. It's a story about contracts signed under pressure. Because sometimes, the most decisive battles happen after the fighting stops. So ask yourself this: who really won the war? Britain won the war. That's the line everyone remembers. The photographs show cheering crowds, flags in the streets, Churchill waving from a balcony, victory framed as triumph, strength, moral clarity. But victory is a strange word when your cities are rubble, your economy is hollowed out, and your future is already mortgaged. For Britain, winning didn't feel like conquest. It felt like making it through the night, like holding on just long enough not to collapse. The factories were exhausted. The population was rationed and worn down. The empire was still standing, but only in shape, not in strength. This wasn't a nation celebrating success, it was a nation catching its breath. And that distinction matters, because there's a difference between winning and surviving. Winning leaves you stronger. Survival just means you're still alive. And survival often comes with conditions. Britain didn't walk out of the war richer, freer, or more powerful. It walked out standing, but leaning heavily on someone else. And the price of that support had already been set. So here's the uncomfortable thought that history prefers to skip. What if surviving was the most expensive outcome of all? Before the war, Britain wasn't a fading power clinging to the past. It was the center of the world's economy. In 1939, London was where money moved. The pound sterling wasn't just currency, it was trust. Governments held it, traders settled in it, entire economies depended on it. Britain owned railways in South America, mines in Africa, plantations in Asia. Its investments stretched across oceans, its ships connected markets, its banks financed trade on every continent. On paper, Britain looked unstoppable. It controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land surface, not through chaos, but through systems, trade networks, financial agreements, imperial preference. Gold sat in its vaults. Overseas investments generated steady income. This wasn't brute force wealth. It was structured, accumulated, deeply embedded power. Think of it like a balance sheet before a collapse. Assets everywhere, revenue flowing, confidence high. And that's what made what came next possible. Because empires don't fall from nothing, they fall from height. The higher the position, the more valuable the assets. And when pressure comes real, those assets become leverage. Britain didn't enter the war poor. It entered rich, which is exactly why it had so much to lose. Empires don't fall from zero, they fall from the top. When the war began, the United States called itself neutral. That word carried comfort, safety, distance. America would stay out of Europe's bloodshed. That's how it was sold to the public. But neutrality didn't mean disengagement. It meant something else entirely. It meant rules. Under the Neutrality Acts, Britain could still buy American weapons, fuel, steel, aircraft, everything it needed to survive. But there was a condition: no loans, no credit, no favors, cash, upfront. And Britain had to transport everything itself. Cash and carry. It sounded fair, even principled. Why should American taxpayers pay for a foreign war? But in practice, it was a financial vice. Every plane Britain bought drained its dollar reserves. Every shipload of oil meant more gold, leaving London. Every contract shortened the runway. Neutrality didn't stop the war from costing Britain. It ensured Britain paid immediately, relentlessly, with no delay. This wasn't ideology. It was leverage. America stayed officially out of the fighting, while positioning itself as the only store open during a global emergency. And stores don't give things away when demand is absolute. Neutral didn't mean harmless. It meant Britain paid for survival day by day until there was nothing left to pay with. By the summer of 1940, Britain's balance sheet wasn't just shrinking, it was bleeding. So the government made a decision that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. They called it Operation Fish. Quietly, under cover of war, Britain began loading its gold reserves onto ships. Not symbolically, physically, gold bars, securities. The financial backbone of an empire, packed into crates and lowered into shipholds. These vessels didn't sail through calm waters. German U-boats hunted the Atlantic relentlessly. One torpedo, one mistake, and centuries of accumulated wealth would sink to the ocean floor. But Britain had no alternative. Cash and carry meant the bills were due now, and this gold was all that remained. So the empire shipped its future across the sea to be stored in Canadian and American vaults, far from London. This wasn't investment. It wasn't strategy. It was liquidation under fire. Once that gold left Britain's shores, something changed. Power doesn't just reside in armies or flags. It lives in reserves, in options, in the ability to say no. And Britain had just given all of that up. Once the gold left, there was no way back. In December 1940, Winston Churchill picked up his pen and wrote what would become the most famous letter of his career. It's usually taught as a plea, a desperate appeal from one leader to another. Britain standing alone, bombs falling, help requested in the name of freedom. But read the words carefully, and the tone shifts. Churchill wasn't asking for assistance. He was admitting something far more dangerous. Britain was broke, not struggling, not stretched, bankrupt. The treasury had no dollars left. The gold had been shipped. The reserves were gone. This was not a negotiation between equals. It was a disclosure of weakness. Once that admission crossed the Atlantic, the balance of power shifted permanently. Because when you tell someone you cannot pay, you also tell them you cannot refuse. From that moment on, every conversation was framed by desperation. Every offer came with conditions, and every condition was accepted because the alternative was collapse. This wasn't a request. It was a confession. The story that followed was carefully packaged for the public. President Roosevelt explained it with a simple image. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him a garden hose, you lend it to him. When the fire is out, he gives it back. That, he said, was Lend-Lease. It was warm, moral, easy to understand, and almost entirely false. Because hoses don't come with audits. They don't come with clauses. They don't require you to sell your furniture before the water turns on. What happened behind closed doors looked nothing like generosity. It looked like leverage. Britain wasn't being helped. It was being evaluated, measured, stripped down to see what else could be taken before aid began. Lend-Lease didn't start with supplies. It started with conditions, with spreadsheets, with legal language that mattered more than speeches. The name itself gave it away. Lend, lease, not give, not share, temporary, accounted for, reversible. Beautiful stories are often told to hide ugly contracts. And this one hid the most expensive contract Britain would ever sign. Behind that contract stood a man most people have never heard of. Henry Morgenthau Jr. Not a general, not a diplomat, not a public hero. He was the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. And during Britain's darkest hour, he controlled the gate. Morgenthau didn't speak in moral language, he spoke in numbers, balance sheets, conditions. To him, this wasn't a war story, it was a financial one. And financial stories have rules. Before a single dollar of aid would flow, Morgenthau wanted proof. Proof that Britain had nothing left. Proof that every alternative had been exhausted. Proof that no British asset anywhere in the world could still be sold. This wasn't cruelty in his mind, it was policy. Why, he asked, should American taxpayers subsidize a war if Britain still owned factories, companies, investments, or income streams? If assets existed, they should be liquidated first. Only then would aid be justified. No speeches, no sentiment, just accounting. Empires aren't dismantled by generals. They're dismantled by accountants. The next demand wasn't for weapons. It was for information. The U.S. Treasury wanted a complete inventory of British wealth. Not estimates, not summaries, everything. Government assets, private investments, corporate holdings, railways, mines, shares, dividends. Any British-owned value, anywhere on the planet. Think about what that meant. Britain was fighting for survival. Its cities were under nightly bombardment, and America's condition for aid was simple: prove you are truly poor. This was the audit of a dying empire. Every asset was counted like furniture in a foreclosed house, not to help rebuild it, but to decide what could still be taken. British negotiators tried to explain that selling long-term investments during a war would destroy the country's future, that it would be a fire sale, that Britain would get pennies on the pound. The response was cold. If Britain still had assets, then Britain still had options. And as long as options existed, aid would wait. Aid only comes after everything is counted. And once everything is counted, there's nowhere left to hide. Once the inventory was complete, the next step was inevitable: sell. Not slowly, not carefully. Now, British-owned companies in the United States were ordered onto the market immediately. There was no time to negotiate, no room to wait for better prices. Everyone knew Britain had to sell. And when a seller has no choice, the buyer sets the terms. One case made the logic brutally clear. American Viscose Corporation, a major industrial company, profitable, strategic, British-owned. It generated steady income that flowed back to London every year. Exactly the kind of asset a country keeps during hard times. The US Treasury demanded it be sold. The British government resisted. Selling under wartime pressure would slash its value. But the message was blunt. Sell or lend. Lease dies in Congress. No sale, no aid. No aid, no survival. So Britain seized the company from its own owners under emergency powers and sold it into a market that smelled blood. Investment banks handled the deal. They knew Britain was desperate. The price reflected that. Half its real value. Gone. That sale wasn't an exception. It was the model. Stocks, bonds, securities, entire portfolios built over generations were dumped. Britain wasn't negotiating anymore. Desperation sets the price. And once the first asset fell, the rest followed. The humiliation didn't stop with companies and shares. It went deeper, strategic, irreversible. Before Lend-Lease was even formally approved, Britain struck another deal born of panic. The Atlantic was infested with German submarines. British shipping was being sunk faster than it could be replaced. The Royal Navy needed destroyers immediately. The United States had some to spare. Old ones, left over from the previous war, rusting in ports, barely seaworthy. Britain took them anyway. In exchange, it gave something far more valuable. 99-year leases on military bases across the Atlantic world, Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, British Guiana, gateways, choke points, entire arcs of the Western Hemisphere. Think about the trade. Scrap metal for global reach, obsolete ships for permanent positioning. Those bases became the backbone of American military power beyond its borders. They allowed the United States to project force across oceans long after the war ended. Britain didn't just give up equipment. It gave up space, influence, control. This wasn't defense. It was foreclosure. And Britain signed because there was no other option left. Hidden inside the legal language of Lend-Lease was a clause that sounded harmless, technical, almost boring. Article VII? It didn't mention empires. It didn't mention power. It talked about trade, about fairness, about removing discriminatory practices after the war was over. But those words carried a weapon. For Britain, discriminatory practices weren't exploitation. They were survival. Imperial preference was the system that held the empire together economically. British goods were given favorable treatment across imperial markets. Canada, Australia, India, Africa, these regions bought British products because tariffs made them cheaper than foreign competitors. That system protected British industry. It guaranteed demand. It kept factories alive. Article VII required it all to be dismantled. After the war, Britain would open its markets. No preference, no protection. American companies would compete freely across the empire, and American companies were bigger, faster, more efficient, and better capitalized. British negotiators understood exactly what this meant. They said so plainly. This clause would end the empire as an economic unit. It would hollow it out from the inside. But while they debated clauses, bombs were falling. Cities burned, ships sank, food ran low. So Britain signed. The deadliest weapon of the war wasn't a bomb. It was a paragraph. And it detonated years later. While Britain was tearing itself apart to survive, something very different was happening across the Atlantic. American factories were not being bombed. American cities were not rationed. American industry was expanding at full speed. The war didn't just mobilize the United States, it transformed it. Steel mills ran day and night. Assembly lines produced bombers, tanks, ships, then refrigerators, radios, cars. American factories supplied the battlefield and the marketplace at the same time. Britain, meanwhile, had converted almost every inch of industrial capacity to war production. Civilian exports vanished. Long-standing trade relationships were abandoned. And someone stepped into the empty space. American companies did. Markets Britain had built over decades in Latin America, Africa, Asia, were quietly captured, not with flags, with contracts. While British factories made Spitfires, American factories made Spitfires and sold consumer goods to the world Britain no longer served. This wasn't shared sacrifice. It was replacement. By the end of the war, gold that once sat in London rested in American vaults. Financial gravity shifted west. The pound weakened. The dollar hardened. War doesn't just destroy. It redistributes, and someone always grows richer during war. When the war finally ended, Britain thought the worst was over. Japan surrendered. Europe exhaled. Crowds filled the streets. Bells rang. After 6 years of total war, the moment had come to rebuild. Then the lifeline was cut. 7 days after Japan's surrender, the United States terminated Lend-Lease. Instantly. Completely. No transition. No warning period. American supply ships already at sea were ordered to turn around and go home. The flow of food stopped. The flow of fuel stopped. The flow of raw materials stopped. Britain had built its entire wartime economy around that supply chain. Factories were not ready for civilian production. Farms could not feed the population alone. Half the nation's food had been imported and paid for with American credit. Now the credit was gone. What Britain faced wasn't recovery. It was starvation. Officials stared at the numbers in disbelief. Victory had lasted a week. After that, the country stood on the edge of economic collapse with no reserves, no income, and no leverage. Survival, once again, required a deal. Victory lasted 7 days. Into that collapse stepped one man, John Maynard Keynes. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a soldier. He was the most influential economist of his time, the man whose ideas had shaped modern governments. And now, near the end of his life, he was sent to Washington to do something no theory could prepare him for: beg. Keynes believed Britain had earned something more than charity. He believed there was a moral debt. Britain had fought alone while America stayed neutral. It had exhausted its empire buying time for the West. The bill, he argued, should be settled with justice. He didn't ask for a loan. He asked for a grant. $6 billion. Not to enrich Britain, not to restore power, just to prevent collapse, to stop starvation, to allow conversion from war to peace. But moral arguments carry no weight when leverage is gone. The American response was calm, clinical. The war was over. The public was tired. Congress didn't trust Britain's new government. Sympathy did not translate into currency. What Britain was offered instead was a loan, with interest, and with conditions that would strip away what little independence remained. Keynes fought those conditions until his health failed. His body gave out under the strain. Months later, he was dead. Morality has no exchange rate, and Britain signed anyway. The most dangerous condition wasn't the interest rate. It was convertibility. On paper, it sounded reasonable. Britain would make the pound sterling fully convertible into dollars. Anyone holding pounds could exchange them freely. A return to normal trade, a symbol of stability. In reality, it was opening a floodgate. During the war, Britain had forced its empire and trading partners to accept payment in pounds. Those pounds couldn't be converted. They were trapped in a closed system, usable only for British goods. It protected British industry and preserved scarce dollars. Convertibility destroyed that system overnight. The moment the pound was opened, the world rushed for the exit. Countries that had accumulated sterling for years tried to turn it into dollars immediately. Everyone knew American goods were better supplied. Everyone wanted dollars. In weeks, Britain began hemorrhaging money. Hundreds of millions drained away with nothing gained in return. The loan evaporated not through spending but through exchange. Within 5 weeks, the damage was so severe that Britain was forced to suspend convertibility entirely. A quarter of the loan burned for nothing. Confidence shattered. Humiliation complete. Once the door opened, everything rushed out. And Britain learned the hardest lesson in finance. You don't open the dam when the river is against you. Britain didn't fall in a single moment. It stepped back, quietly, administratively, through memos and telegrams. By early 1947, the British government faced a reality it could no longer deny. It could not afford to police the world anymore. Not militarily, not financially, not psychologically. The empire that once guaranteed global order had become an expense it couldn't sustain. So Britain withdrew. In February of that year, a message crossed the Atlantic. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, it was practical. Britain informed the United States that it could no longer support Greece and Turkey. For a century, Britain had held the line there, keeping Soviet influence out of the Mediterranean. Now, it was done. The message was simple. We can't pay for this anymore. That single admission triggered a handover. The Truman Doctrine. America stepped in to fill the gap. Military aid, economic aid, bases, influence. Power doesn't disappear when one empire collapses. It moves, it concentrates, it finds a new center. Someone always fills the vacuum. And from that moment on, Britain was no longer the one making the call. Britain was not the exception. It was the prototype. What happened between 1940 and 1947 wasn't an accident of history. It was a system being tested, then reused. After the war, Germany lay in ruins. Its cities flattened, its economy shattered. The Marshall Plan arrived wrapped in hope and generosity. Aid flowed in, factories reopened, prosperity returned, but the conditions came with it. Open markets, American goods, American influence, American bases that never left. Japan followed a similar path, rebuilt with American capital, reshaped under American oversight, protected by American power, dependent on it. Even today, its economy is tied to U.S. debt. Its security tied to U.S. bases, its autonomy constrained by agreements signed in crisis. The pattern repeats because it works. Crisis creates urgency. Urgency removes choice. And when choice disappears, Contracts become destiny. Aid arrives, but sovereignty leaks out through the fine print. Britain learned it first, others learned it later. This wasn't the last time it happened. It was just the first time it worked perfectly. This wasn't the end of the story. The story ends where it began. December 2006. No crowds, no headlines. Just a transaction. The British Treasury sent its final payment to the United States, the last installment on a loan signed in desperation 60 years earlier, a war fought by grandparents, paid for by grandchildren. By then, the empire was long gone, colonies independent, bases surrendered, markets lost, the world had moved on. But the debt remained, quiet, persistent, patient. That's the real cost of survival, not measured in medals or memorials, but in decades of interest payments. In choices never made because leverage was gone, in a future slowly shaped by conditions agreed to under pressure. Britain didn't default. It honored the contract. That's what makes this story uncomfortable, because the system worked exactly as designed. The war ended in 1945. The bill ended in 2006. And that raises a final question. What price will the next ally pay? Empires don't collapse the way they used to. They don't fall to invading armies or burning capitals, they fade behind paperwork. They shrink through clauses, conditions, and carefully worded agreements signed during moments of panic. What happened to Britain wasn't betrayal. It wasn't charity either. It was business, conducted calmly while bombs were falling. Survival was offered, but only in exchange for the future. That's the lesson worth remembering, because the tools haven't changed. Debt, currency control, conditional aid, military bases framed as protection. The language is softer now, the contracts are longer. But the logic is the same. When a nation is desperate, it doesn't negotiate well. It accepts terms. And once those terms are locked in, power doesn't need to be taken by force. It's already been transferred. This isn't about hating allies or rewriting history. It's about understanding how power actually moves in the modern world. Quietly, legally, permanently. Power doesn't announce itself anymore. If this story helped you see the pattern, stay watching. Because the next crisis is never announced in advance.